So we'll see how this goes. Does anybody here remember the English Revolution? Yeah, when was that?
1640.
Close. Does anybody remember Knockham Hill?
Yeah, I know where it is, but I don't know.
Where, do you know where it is? Do you go down there and get some vegetables from Four Town Farm?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Does anybody remember Roger Williams? Yeah, that was the easy one, right? Yeah, well anyway. Anybody remember the College of Rhode Island?
Brown University.
It was the previous name to what's now Brown University. Anybody remember the Warren Association? No. John Miles.
Oh, yeah, I heard of that. Yeah.
How many have heard of John Miles? Okay, that's good. Oh, that's amazing. From Swansea, Wales. Does anybody remember disestablishment? Does anybody know what disestablishment is?
I just remember it was the longest word in the dictionary.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism, yeah. Okay. Disestablishment is when people in Massachusetts quit paying taxes for the church. Thomas Willett. Okay, this is a good group. I like this, yeah. Anybody remember Swansea? Yay! Yes. Okay, if I were to ask you your first response to Baptist.
My mother.
Your mother. Okay, that's safer than some I get. Anybody like to talk about church and politics?
No.
This is why I think we have had a lapse of memory. There we go. My name's Charlie Hartman. I was asked to be the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Swansea in 2001. And at that point I began finding out that the history of our congregation was extensive. But I want to read this from Thomas Bicknell. You all know who Bicknell is. Okay. All that has been written of him, I dare say, would not cover 10 duodecimo pages, but he worked so sweetly and quietly in troublous times, and withal so effectually, and in an obscure corner of our colonial life, illustrated by his faith, his works, in so charitable and so peaceable a manner, that in his ministrations and influence, those who came to scoff remained to pray. He suggested valuable lessons in development of civil and religious freedoms. And that's the part of the heritage that we want to explore today. Okay. Anybody remember Rachel Saunders?
Yeah.
Rachel Saunders is one of the people who helped me put this whole story together. You see on the screen there a couple of scraps of old newspapers. That was 1963 when we celebrated our 300th anniversary. But when I was called to be the pastor, they asked me to tell the Swansea story. So I've been working on that now for about 19 years. Let me make sure this works here. The reason that I want to tell the story is because we do have a heritage that sometimes we forget. That sometimes little tiny things, little tiny congregations in those obscure places in the colonies have had a tremendous impact on the things that we assume have always been there. So we follow this path of experience. We try to gather the evidences. I know you're all like those dusty old records up in the library there, so that we can identify who we are. Once, when I first came to Swansea, I was a part of a group called the Baptist Discussion Group, which was engaged in trying to understand who we as Baptists are, because it has gotten a little foggy for some of us. That's a whole nother lecture. So people began to forget about the Swansea congregation, my guess, someplace around 1848 when they began to be mainstream, but they weren't always mainstream. Yes. And there's just one other quote. I won't read a lot, but one of the things that I did to prepare for this paper, the presentation, is I wrote a paper, which I recently submitted, but Henry Melville King. One of the things that happens is every once in a while the memories bubble up again. So around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, Bicknell and Henry Melville King began to look at the history of the Swansea Church. There was academic work done then, but since then, I think our book is the next biggest publication. That's 100 years later. This is the transcription of the early records of the Swansea Church. They go back to 1649. It's now in 106 research libraries across the world. But Melville King wrote in 1905, "The strong personality of the founder of a local church often leaves its impress on the spiritual body, which he nourishes into being and fosters during the period of its infancy. Roger Williams, John Clark, and John Miles were founders of churches which have lived until now, 357 years, and indeed the life and the institution, and have influenced in no small measure the thought and life of their communities, and indeed the life of the institutions of the whole nation." When I start to tell the story that's 357 years old, we need to look both in England and in our own colonial history, because this was one of the first places where the political and religious changes crossed the Atlantic. So some of us know about Baptists. We had one Baptist, right? When did the Baptists begin? Okay. In that case, I'll forgive you. 1608. There were a couple of them. Some of them are in England. Some of them began to go across the English Channel to Leiden and Amsterdam. Those people continued to develop, and eventually they created a church in which John Miles came. So this is the English side. John Miles was born in England. And the real question for historians, the real question for genealogists is how they get here, right? Who'd they come from? What people were they associated with? Well, until recently, it was kind of vague, but now we're beginning to find some real evidence that connects all of the English history with the colonial history. If you're a church historian, you know about that first line, the early church, Orthodoxy, Roman Catholics, Orthodox split, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. In the Reformation, there are three major branches: Lutherans, Calvinists, and Pietists. They all kind of were in conflict with each other. Eventually, as we know, Henry VIII and the Pope didn't get along, and so they broke from the Roman Church. The solution was to worship like the Roman Church but have a Protestant theology. It's the Elizabethan settlement. But even then, people kept thinking the church could be pure, it could be more like the church was when it was founded in the first centuries. So reform, a movement against the conformity of belief, and state versus the church. We believe in the separation of church and state in this country, right? Do we believe in the separation between religion and politics? No, we don't. Just look at the news, folks. Part of our roots come in that kind of conflict. James I in the 17th century was Roman Catholic, but he was a very pious man, and he had them retranslate the Bible. It's the King James Version, right? So he was moving England towards the Roman Catholic side, but he died, as happens to people, and Charles I, his son, took over, and he was kind of favorable to the Roman Catholics, but he also had this problem because all these Protestants now were beginning to make their wants and wishes known in Parliament. And he needed money to fight his wars, and so there was some conflict. Eventually, we know that Charles I lost his head in January of 1649. And Oliver Cromwell took over. This is a period, this whole century, of tremendous change. We see Hobbes and Locke are talking about the social contract. John Milton is writing these tremendous poems. He wrote one called The Leviathan, which was a critique of the English government. So the issue here was toleration. So the Church of England begins to get put back together. The Puritans want to purify the church. And then there was this group called the Separatists, and these were the people who had gone to Holland and eventually came here. But we'll get to that in a minute. They wanted to eliminate the corruption, and so they began to be Congregationalists and eliminated the hierarchies of the church. But there were some that didn't even want to cooperate with each other, and we call them independents, a word that we use a lot these days. And then in those independents, there was those that didn't want to use a prayer book, they didn't want to put on robes, they wanted people to talk in worship. And they became Baptists with one more little piece to it. A believer's baptism, as opposed to your baby, you go down, they throw water on you, and you're in the church. The Baptists wanted you to explain why you were making that decision. John Robinson went to the Leiden community. He was a separatist. Smith and Helwas were the other kind of Baptists. They were Arminian rather than Calvinistic. And that all began in an area of England called the Scrooby congregations, which are kind of up in this area here, not too far from the boat in case you needed to get out of town. So they went to the Netherlands. About 1611 or 12, they came back. Helwas wrote a letter to the king, said he's just a man, he can't tell us how to worship, and he went to jail for the rest of his life. Robinson stayed in Leiden until he died. In the meantime, John Miles was born 1621 in Herefordshire, which is right on the border between Wales and England. In 1638, he was at Oxford, Brasenose College. Remember, about that time, Roger Williams was founding Providence. In 1649, he goes to the Glass House Church. Now, the Glass House Church is the important piece because that's the hub to the rest of the development that will eventually contact at least two other congregations in the colonies. In the government, Miles becomes a trier. A trier is somebody who is on the board that says you can preach or you can't preach. So he was approving people for Orthodox religion, which at that point was dissenting and separatist. So what we see here, now I'll get over kind of on this side, is here is John Robinson's community. Those are what we now call the Pilgrims. They came over to Plymouth. From Plymouth came Rehoboth, and eventually from Rehoboth came Obadiah Holmes, and John Miles comes to the Rehoboth Church. We'll get to that in a minute. The English development is from Henry Jacob, who became the elder of Robinson's Church in Southwark. Then it goes to Lathrop, Jesse, Spilsbury, Kiffin, Consett, and Draper, and that's where John Miles joins the Revolution. He was a separatist, Puritan, nonconformist, but he was the one who organized churches on both sides of the Atlantic. He was not as strict as some of the people who came later. He was latitudinarian, which we'll explore in a minute. I don't know if you can see this. This is a picture of the John Miles book. This is a plaque given to us in 1963 when we celebrated our 300th. Okay, we're going to jump over to the colonial history now. 1620, the Plymouth gets settled over here. 1630s, the Massachusetts Bay begins to settle the lands north of us. Roger Williams is putting a church together in Providence because he'd been thrown out of the Bay. He came down from Salem. John Clark is in the Mass Bay, but he's thrown out with some other people, the Antinomians. Then we get to some people who you're probably a little more familiar with in the Rehoboth history. The Newman Church, 1642. I don't know, somebody might argue 1643. So anyway, it was a Puritan congregational church, and in that, these are where my notes are, yeah. Yeah, you'll notice, and I want to thank Dave Weed for the overlay, because he took that old map of the first territories and put it on a current map, and it worked. It all laid out. But if you look at some of those names of those original proprietors, Obadiah Holmes, Joseph Torrey, William Carpenter, these are all names that eventually are associated with Baptists as opposed to Congregationalists. We love everybody. Yeah. Yeah, you're from the Newman Church? Yep, okay. One of the reasons that people ended up in Plymouth County, Plymouth Colony, rather than the Mass Bay, was because in 1644 this was the law. Those who were Anabaptists, we remember the Anabaptists in that three-pronged Reformation were the Pietists. They were like Mennonites and other variations. In Münster, Germany in 1530, they took over the town. They were so libertarian, they did all sorts of things that the normal people didn't like. So they came in and captured them and pinched them to death with hot tongs and left their bodies high in the church steeples. I happened to go to Münster to study when I was at Kalamazoo with Dave. So anyway, this reputation lasted 100 years or more, and these Anabaptists, which are the people who were not baptizing their children, became the infectors of persons in main matters and troublers of churches where they have been, and they held, incendiaries of the Commonwealth. That's the line I wanted. So if somebody has to leave England, are you going to come to Mass Bay, or are you going to come to Plymouth Colony where there's more tolerance? As near as I can tell, this is a Rehoboth timeline. Newman comes down and establishes church someplace 1642, 1643. I believe he came from Weymouth, according to Bicknell anyway. Now, Obadiah Holmes is already in the proprietorship. He owns the land here, but he comes down from Salem, which was where Roger Williams had been, in about 1646, and he comes down and he begins to be a part of the church. Well, after a while, evidently Obadiah Holmes was one cranky dude. And he was arguing with everybody, and so he got into a little dust-up with Pastor Newman and eventually left. While he was there, he gathered a group of people around him who I called Proto-Baptists. They were the group that from 1649 to 1663 existed within the Newman Congregational Church. In the meantime, Holmes is off. He goes to Newport to be with John Clark. He comes back up to Lynn, and they go to, what was the guy's name? Witter. And they're preaching against infant baptism. See, and then the political operatives, the magistrates, come up, arrest him. Holmes is whipped on the Common in Boston, 30 lashes well laid on. The pictures there are Newman's grave and the Newman Congregational Church. So about 1663 now, that's when Miles begins to need to leave England. So we'll get there in a minute. But there's trouble in Rehoboth. Evidently, in the conflict between Obadiah and Samuel Newman, there was a vote. 7 people said, nope, Obadiah's got to go. Well, the thing with the Baptists is it's got to be a whole majority. So they sued each other, they argued. Eventually, the church votes 12 to 11, and that's when Obadiah leaves. Then there's this interim period of about 20 years until this guy Miles shows up. And he's been invited by James Brown to actually do lectures at the Newman Church. But they also set up a Baptist church, and they do it publicly. They don't hide it. And all of a sudden, this is Brayton speaking in 1891, nevertheless, as soon as it became known that there was a Baptist church, the authorities, the political people, come down and say, nope, we're going to fine you, and you have to go someplace else where you will not bother any other church. You won't prejudice any church. And so, Knockham Hill. Knockham Hill is right in here. The area that they went to was called Soames. It was the land base of the Pokanoket people. And this area had been purchased, and I'm not sure if you talk to the Pokanokets now if purchase is the word that they would use, but John Brown, who had been influenced by the Robinson community, his son was James Brown. We'll see them in a minute. But John Brown with Josiah Winslow purchased this area. John Brown and his family lived in Wannamoisett, which is now East Providence. And the area where the church was, which is actually up towards East Providence, they now pushed these Baptists down into the area Chechacas, which is New Meadow Neck. The picture in the middle is the current site of what we believe was the first Baptist meeting house in the Americas, which was ours, 20-some years before Providence, 11 years before Boston, 40 years before Newport. But we are bragging, yes. And so that's another old map. You kind of see the Narragansett Bay. Soames was a beautiful place. Soames was the garden spot of Plymouth. So that was the place that they were able to go. Again, John Brown influenced by the Robinson community, the separatists. He might have been, Dr. Breckney says, excuse me, related to the Brownists, who were the real radicals of the dissenters in England. He died in 1663. Samuel Newman died in 1663. And all of a sudden there's a Baptist church in 1663 that's now being located at Knockham Hill. James Brown was a member of that group that had originally been convinced of Baptist ways of anti-pedobaptism by John Clark and Mark Lucar. Mark Lucar came from the Glasshouse Church in London. John Clark had ill news from New England published by a member of the Glasshouse Church in 1652. So we know that this church is a real hub that supported both there and here. If anybody's read McLaughlin from Brown, he thinks there wasn't any conversation between England and the colonies, but he was wrong. And we have letters to prove it. So James Brown also was an assistant governor in the Plymouth colony. And that makes a lot of, has a lot of significance, because when John Miles goes in 1675 during the war to Boston, he doesn't want to stay up there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Thomas Willett. You said earlier most of you are familiar with Thomas Willett. Willett Avenue in East Providence. He was, pardon?
First mayor of New York.
First mayor of New York. He was married to Mary Brown, James's sister, daughter of John Brown. He had been sent up to the Penobscot area to do the fur trade. He settled that all out. So he became a fairly prosperous man, very politically prominent. He had a shipping business. He was a member of the Newman Congregational Church, and he was an ally and a friend of John Miles. It was Willett who was given the responsibility to find somebody to do the lectures. He helped settle the town, and he was first mayor of New York City after the English took over. That's because he could speak Dutch. Yeah, okay. So these are the constituent members: James Brown, Nicholas Tanner, Joseph Carpenter. Carpenter and Butterworth, Brown, as far as I know, all lived in Rehoboth. Nicholas Tanner was the only one who came from England to the Plymouth colony with John Miles. The covenant that we began the church with, that organized the church, is the oldest extant covenant, Baptist covenant in the Americas. And it is, as I said earlier, because Miles was latitudinarian, he kind of cast a wide net, which some of the Puritans did not appreciate. But he said things in here like, we are ready to accept and receive to and hold communion with, all by a judgment of charity we conceive to be fellow members with us in our head Jesus Christ, though differing from us in controversial points, as are not absolutely and essentially necessary for salvation. That opens a huge theological door. And that's where John Miles kind of gives us a little more encouragement to think, well, it doesn't always have to be done this way. And back then, it was really important to be baptized, because baptism was your enfranchisement. If you were not a baptized member of a established church, you couldn't vote. So when Miles in his latitudinarian says, well, infant baptism isn't necessary for salvation, all of a sudden the social fabric, the political fabric begins to fray. Well, this was a controversy that went on for a while. But one of the things that had happened early on was, as they were forming town, this 1667, Miles and Willett and Butterworth talked to each other and come up with another covenant, which I call the town covenant, which, as it says here, yet in controversy among the godly learned the belief thereof, and this is the essential stuff to salvation, such as paedobaptism, church discipline alike, doesn't matter. We're not going to argue over the stuff that isn't important. But here, the minister or the ministers of the town may take their liberty to baptize infants or grown persons as the Lord shall persuade their conscience. And so also the inhabitants of the town to take their liberty to bring their children to baptism or not. This was the real difference. You could choose whether you wanted your children baptized or not. Okay, little refresher here. Born in Herefordshire, went to Oxford, Trier, went to London with Thomas Proud to the Glasshouse Church. About the same time that Obadiah Holmes was in Rehoboth, and he got a letter from the Glasshouse Church, Kiffin as their leader, after he had been whipped in Boston. And those are in the Newport Church's records. 1662, Miles comes to Massachusetts. Why to Massachusetts? Well, it wasn't Massachusetts, it was Plymouth. They write the covenant. The Baptists gather, they get thrown out, they're at Knockham Hill, town of Swansea begins to grow up, and then all of a sudden, the King Philip War. So Miles goes off to Boston for a few years, eventually comes back, and he dies in 1683. The rock that you see on the top right there is at, yeah, one right on my head. Tyler Point, thank you, sir. And it's all grown up now, but you can see, we don't know exactly where his grave is, but that was the second place where we had a meeting house. The photograph in the bottom corner there is the original chapel of the Swansea Church in Swansea, Wales. Okay, this is how they got here. All those Baptists went to the Netherlands and Amsterdam from the Scrooby Gainsborough congregations. The Puritan separatists came down to their first particular Calvinistic church in 1638 with Spilsbury. That evolved the Glasshouse Church. The Glasshouse Church is where Miles went to. He goes back to Wales and he founds 5 other Baptist churches. By 1662, we have a new king. Charles II is on the throne. At first, he's going to be tolerant, but then he says, nah. And so Miles and others have to leave. They're ejected. Where do they go? Well, we're beginning to see that he has some connections over in Plymouth Colony. John and James Brown are there as a group, but Obadiah Holmes is already in touch with the people in the Glasshouse Church. So when they all communicate, Miles has a place to go. We've had 4 meeting houses. First one was burned at Knockham Hill in the Metacom War. Next one went to Tyler's Point. Some people say it was dragged up the hill, the river. Others differ. You know how that goes. We built the largest meeting house for it. Was the largest Calvinistic Baptist church in New England by the early 1700s. That was torn down. Our new building, 1848, was built. And in 1960, there was an addition put on it for the Sunday school. Why did Miles come to Rehoboth? This is one of those questions, right? Finally, in the last 3 months, I have evidence to put this in a coherent timeline. Rehoboth Proto-Baptist Group with Obadiah Holmes. John Clark is working with Roger Williams to get the Antinomians over in Portsmouth all settled out with the Narragansetts. John Miles comes after the execution of the king to London. He's given authority and he's given a mission, and he goes back and he founds churches. Obadiah Holmes is with John Clark in 1650. And then Obadiah Holmes is with the Glasshouse Church in 1651. And John Clark has his books published from people who, Henry Hills is the guy's name, at the Glasshouse Church in 1652. Where do you go? They said, there's these nice group of people over in Rehoboth. I think you'll really like them. And so off they go. He goes. Exactly how, by which ship, we don't know yet. But there were people in the Boston Church and Willett, all who were doing international shipping. Yes?
Can you explain? I don't know. The Glasshouse Church?
The Glasshouse Church was a congregation. It was called the Glasshouse because the building in which the glasshouse, the building in which the people met, manufactured glass. So it's called Glasshouse.
In England?
This is in England on Broad Street.
London?
London, yes. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Okay. So here the Swansea Baptists, here's a guy who was very popular, very central to the leadership in London. And now he's over here. We understand that we are right between the particular or the Calvinistic churches, one in Boston, one in Newport. And why am I not including Providence? Because they were General Baptists. And we had kind of a handshake with them, but it was another 100 years before they really got their thing together. The picture on the right is Obadiah Holmes. That's in the First Baptist Church in Boston. If you've ever been up to their big cathedral. There's also a John Clark memorial there. And again, that's the Bicknell stone that was set 1905. So we know that they were connected with a lot of different important people in the development of what we now know as Baptists. The Antinomians, Clark, Hutchinson, Coddington, they came down to Quidnick Island. Clark and Williams helped get them there. Obadiah Holmes, who had been here in Rehoboth, went to Newport and was their leader while Clark was in England getting the 1663 charter. We know that we've always had a really good relationship with the Newport Baptists, particularly through the 17th, 18th centuries. John Comer, who was pastor there, and Samuel Maxwell, who was our fourth pastor, were all associated with the Newport Church. This is probably one of the more interesting periods of our early history. Miles escaped, like most of the other people in Swansea, to safer territories in the north. At first, the relationship between the indigenous people and the settlers there was fairly cooperative. Thomas Willett, who had been effective in Maine with the indigenous people there, had come down. There's legends that says, that they came to his house to burn it, but they saw who it was, and he was in prayer, and they left him. But he was really instrumental in keeping things calm for a while. But then, after the beginning of the war, all of the buildings in Swansea were destroyed, but not the garrison house. That was there until 1913. It had escaped, but it was the garrison house. If you read the Mayflower, the Philbrick book, that's the place where he describes the beginning of the conflict. They're shooting arrows and bullets across the way. But in Boston, while Miles was there, he was offered the eldership. He could have been their pastor. But he turned that down. But we also see letters from the Glasshouse Church in London, this hub church, to the church in Boston, because they were working to support each other on the issues that they all had. But Miles came back to Swansea for these reasons, I believe. He was in Swansea, the political tolerance was just so much greater. He had one of the assistant governors sitting in the pews. There was nobody boarding the doors up, nailing them shut like happened in Boston. People were pretty open and kind of calm about having Baptists. But again, Miles was a compromiser. He said, yeah, it's a big tent. So they rebuilt the meeting house. But the other reason he came back was they gave him 200 acres of land. They rebuilt his house, they rebuilt the church. I'd come back too. Yeah. Okay. I just want to make one little point with this one. The key to the history of religious liberty in New England lies in the story of the Baptists who did not run away to Rogues Island. We know where that is, across the bridge, but who stuck it out in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth colonies. How did we really get religious freedom in this country? We had people who were working on it. Okay, now we're kind of over on the right-hand side of the Knockham Hill moment. We're beginning to see that the people from England are going to come to Pennsylvania, the Welsh Irish Baptists, because in 70, 80, I forgot the number, when James II was on the throne, he was Catholic, and so he began to persecute the Baptists, and so Philadelphia, the Pennypack Church, Welsh tract churches, all began to happen in Pennsylvania. Eventually, they came together as the Philadelphia Association, which was interested in founding schools. One of the things that everybody should have is a really bright child. My son, as he was doing his PhD, was working with a woman who talked about institutional connections and the way that we move ideas and policies and polities from institution to institution, from leader to leader. And my thesis is that right from John Miles to this very day, we can connect institution to institution, leader to leader. Miles went to London to the separatists. They performed all those separatist churches, but he also founded the Welsh churches, which eventually came to Pennsylvania. And so these all began to focus on this area up here when in 1762 the people in the town of Warren come to the Swansea church and say, can we form another church? There are people with the Philadelphia Association. They want to call a guy to be the pastor, James Manning, but we also want him to be the first president of the College of Rhode Island. In this period of our history, we start spinning off churches in several ways. The Oak Swamp Church, which was right in this area some here. There's a little sign there that we took. There's a picture from an old book. But these were the people who, again, this is Comer and Maxwell. These are people who are associated with both the Newport Church and the Swansea Church. But probably the biggest and the most important of our children, we have 22, I think, is the Baptist Church in Warren. Again, the Philadelphia Association with the Welsh-Irish traditions. Morgan Edwards comes up from Philadelphia. They picked James Manning to be their pastor. The Warren Association is formed of all these other Baptist churches. Swansea was not included. That's a whole other story. In 1778, the English burned their building, arrested their pastor. You know, history. And the Warren congregation rejoined the Swansea congregation for 20 years with a specific instruction that when they could, they would reconstitute their church, rebuild their building, and go back. But when the church went back, pastor stayed in Swansea. Oh, there we go. James Manning, that's a little fuzzy. Born in Piscataway, New Jersey. Graduated from the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton, I think. Was identified by the Philadelphia Association as their golden boy. Brought him up, put him in the church in Warren. By 1770, they'd run out of money, so they asked the Brown family for a little support. And Manning moved to the First Baptist Church in Providence. Now, that was really the time when the Calvinistic Baptists and the General Baptists began to think more alike. And the hyper-Calvinism of predestination began to fade because it didn't work very well. And these people all had this more central thing about the separation of church and state. And so that became kind of the center theme that Isaac Backus picked up, along with the Warren Association. They did protests, they did letters, they tried to change the political forms in a lot of ways. And finally, in 1833, in Massachusetts, the church was disestablished. Your taxes no longer went to support the established church of standing. So, reason I throw Isaac Backus here, he was a New Light Congregationalist. He became a New Light Baptist, and one of the influences that he had was our Ilston book. He held it while he was writing his history. By this point, they're less Calvinistic and a little more mainstream. And Dr. Stan Lemons says this was really when Baptists became more acceptable to other people. One other figure that is significant in the separation of church and state is John Leland. John Leland was baptized in the Bellingham Church, a daughter church of the Swansea Church, 1737. So he was baptized by Noah Alden, but then he went to Virginia. He was in conversation with Madison and with Jefferson. There's something about a cheese there that is a nice story. He took big cheese down for Madison. But he was also one who was founding churches in Connecticut, including the Danbury Church, which is the letter that was sent to Thomas Jefferson. And in Jefferson's reply, we get the wall of separation between the churches. So here we have the institutions, the leaders, as they just keep coming down the pike here. Yeah, that's John Hay Library. That's where our records are now. 22 congregations, according to Melville King, including Bellingham and Warren, Oswego up in New York, a bunch of others, Warren Station, okay. Okay, the chart that's kind of hard to see on the right is where all the influence went from here. Brown University, as you know, sent people out and established schools all over. Baptist schools, University of Chicago, Kalamazoo College, Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Colgate, Rochester, all sorts of Baptist schools just exploded, led by people who came out of the Brown stream of influence. This one on the right, and I apologize you can't read it, but it's an obituary for Mark Carpenter. Does the name Carpenter ring around? He was a pastor in Vermont, and he died, I think, in 1882, but in his obituary, he tells the whole story of John Miles and his connection to this town, to Rehoboth. So this story is there. People have just kind of had this lapse of memory when we start talking about Swansea. These are some of the other, okay, that's Brown, big there. This is the John Miles book. This is the way it's held in the library. This is a clasp. This is the Estray material. One of the things that happened was Miles had the book, but at some point there became another record book being kept, and it was probably kept by this guy. His name was Hartman. He was a deacon, but he, because, as I mentioned earlier, the town when it was founded had created this land for the pastor, but the pastor was living in a nice little house, up there by the river, and so Harding wanted that land. He wanted to use it for his own, so he kept this record book that was lost for 200 years, resurfaced in 1984 in an antiquarian book sale up in Boston. Robert Anderson bought it, transcribed it, and published it with the New England Genealogical Association. They let us read it. They let us use their transcription. So both of the records are included in our volume 1. So you have a complete order from 1649 to about 1848. All sorts of interesting little things that. Okay, now this is just kind of clean up here. There are a lot of narratives. This is the way I tell the story. Roger, I teach a course on Roger Williams. That's a whole nother conversation. As far as I know, Roger and John never met. Roger did meet John Brown, though. I know that. We have the first meeting house. We have the oldest records. We are non-conforming and dissenting. Well, I don't know about how non-conforming we are now, but then we were. Toleration. One of the heritages that we have is toleration. But there were really two forms of toleration in the 17th century. There was the John Locke kind, where you can have one government that supports, say, a religious organization, and other ones that are not supported. Of course, what we've adopted in the United States is more the Roger Williams, which he actually got from the General Baptists, where there is no association institutionally between the church and the state. The Newman Church was Puritan Congregational. They practiced infant baptism. They were more Calvinistic in their church-state relationships, and they were tax-supported. Now, the Swansea Church was an established church. If I tell Baptists this, they all kind of go, no! But they took tax money. They appointed the pastor. Up until the 1730s, the town had to sign off on who the pastor was. So we were not where Roger was. Roger was really more radical, but Miles was more into the toleration in the John Locke mode. Okay, yeah. I think that's about it. And I will take some questions here. There's lots of bibliography. Lots of bibliography. Lots of bibliography. All righty. Here we go. All right. Questions, comments, throw things at me.
What can you tell us about the Hornbein Baptist Church?
Oh, Hornbein, currently or back then? Hornbein, I think,
Back then? Oh, that's the-
Hornbein was just one of those, during the 1750, if I remember. That would be, towards the end of the First Great Awakening, and the little churches. The one thing about Baptists is, you get 4 or 5 of them together, they split into 2 or 3 groups, and this was a process of differentiation. I'm not sure where they came from. Their history has kind of gotten lost. Currently, there is no congregation there. No Baptist congregation. I'm sorry, there's an American Catholic congregation that uses the building. But they were the same kind of Baptists we were, even up until they really disappeared.
Why was there a controversy over infant baptism versus adult baptism? What caused that? Two schools of
Do you want to go to heaven or don't you?
Well, if I had the choice.
One of the things that we forget, in the 17th century, it was the prevailing notion that you had to be saved in a particular way. Everybody was religious. So if somebody reads the Bible and says, it doesn't talk about putting water on babies, they go, well, if it's not in the Bible, that means I won't be saved if I sprinkle my infant. I have to make some kind of a conscious decision. And so theologically, it was only people who could express their faith became the ones who would go to heaven. Okay, the other twist when you get to New England is that if you're not baptized, you can't vote. And so it becomes not only a religious issue, it becomes an issue of enfranchisement. Yeah. So nowadays, one of the positions is if God is really good, everybody gets saved. That's kind of a universal, but that was also the General Baptist position. Everybody could be saved. In the particular Baptists, only those who were predestined and endured would be saved. So it's that question about salvation.
One other quick one.
Sure.
Since I've got you sitting right standing right
Yeah.
here. Malcolm's Hill, you said it's over by where Four Town Farms is.
Yes.
Was it really a hill there now? Because that's pretty flat.
The word I think actually means a mound of sand.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if you remember, there was one picture, if you come up 100 Acre Cove, what you see is just kind of this sandy beach, although it's treed now. But no, it was not a hill. Actually, the area was all cleared by the Pokanakets and farmed, and the seagrass was a crop that was valued, and they still sell it at Fort Town because they put it on their gardens because it had more minerals in it. They grow better. So that was a move-in area.
Right.
Yeah.
The burial ground is a hill.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, but that's not where Knockham Hill is.
No, I know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The site of the first meeting house and of the circle of the town is about a half a mile from the earliest burial ground, and that rises up. That comes up maybe 20 feet above the water level. Yeah. So.
My question was about the burial ground in Knockham Hill area. I was there recently looking at some ancestral gravestones of carpenters.
Yes.
And noticed that the exit stones are in a kind of a horseshoe, and was wondering if there had been a meeting house in the middle.
No, not as far as I know. The meeting house was over where the marker is. If you go to pick up your corn, the corn's really good this year. Yeah, there's a big triangular stone.
But it just says near this place. I was wondering if
Yeah,
the meeting house
they just the Barrington Preservation Society just had a ground radar survey done, trying to find the old foundations. Now most of the material itself is gone, but the compacting evidently of the dirt is sufficient to get a image, and they have not quite said yes, this is the exact place. It's kind of hard. They're still working on that, but as far as we know, if you were standing in front of the triangular stone, it would be about 20 feet just beyond that fence right there. It's now a horse paddock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe there were earlier burials that didn't have stones then in the central part of the burying ground?
I don't know. I mean, the church moved away from there, obviously during the Poconoket War, and there's another cemetery right across from our current meeting house. Excuse me, the Kickamuit Cemetery is where Samuel Luther is, so there were a lot of them down closer to the Kickamuit River there. So that's what I'm sorry.
You made reference to letters.
Yes.
Were they letters that were at John Hay Library?
The letters are actually a part of the Ilston book, and they are they're transcribed in the book, and they are letters from various churches in Ireland, London, and Wales to each other. One of the central places, obviously, is the Glasshouse Church.
So it wasn't necessarily the actual letters. You got it from maybe textbooks?
No, we got them from the transcription of the original records. They were transcribed there by John Miles.
And just to mention, thanks to Charlie, we have that copy in the research center.
Yeah.
There it is.
There it is.
Nice copy.
As I said, it's now in 106 different libraries, including Oxford. Dr. Brackney lectures in Europe quite a bit, especially at Oxford, so he's taken it around. His reputation far exceeds mine. When he put my name on the book, I was extraordinarily thankful because it was very kind of him. I was really more like a research assistant. I did write some of the parts, but he wrote most of the text. But it's got some biographies in here of the early pastors and early figures, and the transcription of both of the earliest chunks of record. And it's also the first volume of what will be 14 volumes of previously unpublished Baptist material. So Dr. Brackney is really an amazing guy, amazing scholar. When he came down to visit, it's like 11 o'clock at night, I get a call. He says, well, I've been reading this stuff, but I think Boston College's library is still open. I'm going over there. I'm going, 11 o'clock? The man is intense. So, yeah, so.
You mentioned Harding. What was his first name?
I want to say James. Or it could have been John, but I think it was James. And he was a deacon. He was one of the really early members. And so it was kind of like, that's a story I want to tease out a little bit more, because he was a little sneaky, but we still, so, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Charlie, I was going to mention also at the research room is the Rhode Island Genealogical Society publishes Rhode Island Roots.
Okay.
Publishes Rhode Island Gleanings. And the most recent Gleanings had excellent maps of the Solms area in it.
Okay.
So if anybody's interested in more of that, it's available in the research center, and Wendy can help you find that.
Find those. Yeah, good maps are always real.
Where the towns were and
Yeah.
the purchase it was and all that. It's an excellent article.
Yeah, and that helps us kind of get a sense of how this all works together, how the people had to go closer or further away. One of the issues that Miles faced both in Wales and here was the distance between the several smaller groupings. And so everybody would kind of meet out there, but especially in Wales, once a month they'd come from all the different places and have more general meeting. And that's kind of a pattern that got built into Baptist life, where you have a convention or a convocation that comes together and everybody holds up their issues and talks and sings and does stuff like that. Well, in that case, thank you very much. Thank you for indulging me in my obsession here. So.